Hello and welcome to our Early Start Research Seminar. I'm Lisa Kervin and I'm Director of Research here at Early Start. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that wherever we are, we're meeting on Aboriginal country. And for those of us here at Early Start, we meet on Dharawal country. And we know that Dharawal lands stretch from Botany Bay in the south of Sydney right down to Nowra. Physically here at Early Start, at the University of Wollongong, we're based at the base of Mount Kira. And that's a really special area, a women's area for our Aboriginal people, and has always been a great place of knowledge and learning. So how fortunate for us that we get to have these conversations in such a special place. Just a couple of housekeeping notes for us all. So please mute your microphone if you're not speaking. If you'd like to ask a question of the panel at any time, please use the Q&A function or the chat function. And we encourage you to introduce yourselves and to make comments as you would like to. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded to be uploaded on our Early Start YouTube channel. And we certainly are very grateful to those that attend the sessions live, but also the many more that view the sessions afterwards. And we hope that perhaps this is a really useful resource for you to come in and out of as you're thinking about research. So the purpose of our Early Start research seminars is to focus on research methodologies, specifically in early childhood, and to recognise and celebrate the expertise that we have within Early Start, within our ASH faculty, within UOW as a whole, and certainly our external networks. And today it's with great pleasure that I introduce our panel, Lia Sherwood from UOW, who's our Research Development and Impact Manager in our research services, Professor Shirley Agostinho, who comes to us from the School of Education with a lot of expertise and wealth of knowledge in terms of research projects. And our very good friend, Kate Highfield, who is at ACU and comes to us with experience having had the role of research translation in early childhood Australia. So without any further ado, I'm going to stop my screen share and pass over to Lia.
Thanks very much for that, Lisa, and thank you for inviting me here today, Early Start and Lisa. So as Lisa mentioned, I'm the Research Development and Impact Manager here at UOW, and I've got a couple of slides that will be shared after the session and a handout which will be made available to you as well. So hopefully today you will walk away with a few ideas of practical strategies you can put into place, know about a few tools that we have here at UOW, and get a taster of the impact ecosystem. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm grateful to be sustained by the lands, waters and all living things where I work and live, also on Dharawal country, right next to Mount Kira, whose grandmother mountain. I'm looking at Mount Kembla, grandfather mountain. And so every day I'm really privileged to wake up and experience the beauty and country that I see here and see you with today. And so I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that may be watching here today, and the traditional custodians, elders past, present and emerging. So I'll just start sharing my screen and get started on the slides. So what is research impact? And I guess conceptually, it's something that we use in a number of different ways. The word impact means many different things depending on the context. In its simplest form, impact is change. Change, or research impact, is change that has occurred as a result of your research, but from an outsider's perspective. So not from necessarily your individual perspective. You can, of course, your research can have an impact on you personally. But when you're talking about research impact, it's really about what's changed for the next user or the end user. So there are three key messages that I guess I'm hoping you'll walk away with today is understand what impact means, what are the key ingredients, and is there anything you can do now to maximize the impact of your research? So it's important to understand the framework where impact and definitions where impact is being discussed within an institution, and that's really within our government directives and our funders. You'll see that there's a number of different ways that our funders have interpreted the word research impact. And so when you're writing for a grant or writing for a funder, this is what they're expecting to see. The NHMRC has knowledge as part of their research impact, whereas the ARC really talks about beyond academia. There's been a lot of discussion recently on the national interest test, and that's really strategic alignment and the long-term impacts of your research. That's what they're hoping to see. But they also talk about benefits and significance. So all of these words are really looking for you to describe what impact means under their definitions. URW has its own inclusive definition of impact. And in many ways, it's a subtle shift from the government definition, and it tries to ensure that we protect all forms of research with impact. So research training and the impact of research on teaching, fundamental or discovery research, the contributions our research students, early and mid-career researchers make with early outcomes and, leading and contributing to longer term impacts for a program of research. Knowledge exchange with industry, community, government, non-profit stakeholders. So we're really talking about all forms of impact that can occur that arise from your research. Now, there's also this dimension of, impact that you need to also consider, which is your personal motivation and trying to find alignment across all of these different, agendas or expectations of your research is really about coming down to your personal motivation of why you do what you do. What kind of effect do you want your work to have? And how does what you do get you closer to realizing this? How will you know that you realized it, and who should know about it? So really thinking about those different questions can really help you define the impact of your research. And, there can be many dimensions: intellectual, practical, personal, but this personal aspect is really important because it's your intention to have an impact that will lead to a compelling, confident, and persuasive offering for your audience. So that, if you can find that motivator and that driver, then you've kind of really well on your way to describing your research impact. So there's a number of different regimes where impact is, in an academic's life that you have to think about. There's the impact assessment that occurs, and this, is done at a university and is looking backwards at your past impact. There's the track record, which is at an individual level, your promotion, where you write about in grants, where you promote yourself and increase your discoverability through your scholars. And then there's forward-looking, the institutional strategy. We have an impact strategy here at UIW. We have a number of different teams that support engagement. And then we have the funding that arises that comes from, you talking about your research and what you've done and what you hope to achieve. Now, one thing that I think is pretty obvious is that most of us do research, which we expect to have some kind of change occur arising from it. What's often, a gap or an opportunity is, how do we know that we can make these claims of the research and its impact? And that comes through evidence. So there, a number of typical ways that we can evidence the impact of our research to create this compelling and credible argument for the reader or the audience of our impact case study or our impact story. So really consider what evidence might be. I might include this actually in the handouts as well. This is a paper which goes through a few different impact types. So is it, the domain of impact, health and wellbeing? What kind of evidence might support that impact claim from your research? Could be a patient survey, could be a testimonial from a hospital, head of unit. It could be a report on the quality, increase in life years. So there's a number of different types of evidence that you might consider if you're making a particular claim about your research impact. So inherent in this is this planning for impact and knowing that research by its very nature is uncertain, and having a system in place just ensures that we're able to capture changes arising from the work that you do. And then that also means that if some unanticipated benefits arise from your research, you have a way of recognizing and capturing that as well. So planning for impact is an important step. You have the intention, then you move on to planning. Usually we think about doing the research, producing an output, and then moving on to the next project. Impact is really about going further than that and thinking about, and what next, and how will I know? So this is the kind of modified program logic model that you can apply, looking for, ways of evaluating your research throughout its life cycle and modifying it over the design or life of the program. So this is a paper by Phipps, if you wanted to understand how they've talked about the steps to modify, adapt, recognize, modify, and adapt your research throughout its life cycle. Often the addition of people outside of your research or outside of academia can provide better opportunities as well for amplifying or identifying these areas. So this is, I guess, a way of planning. There's also some considerations. This is the 5 Ps. And I guess, you can read through this one later. It's really, for me, thinking about your target audience and how do they consume the knowledge? How will you be able to have that conversation where you can have these discussions? If you include them at the beginning, fantastic. Then you've already kind of done that co-creation and knowledge sharing at the beginning, and you can modify and move through these 5 different steps. But really publishing, it might be that you publish in a trade journal. You might go to a parenting magazine as opposed to a parenting journal to talk about your research. What you also need to consider in this is what are potential barriers or enablers, and how can you leverage those or bring people on that journey with you? So if you can anticipate them as well, you can work towards, I guess, getting a harmonious approach to maximizing the impact of your research. So as I was saying, the planning is really important. And here at UOW, we promote the 4 questions, the UOW Impact Framework, which is built across a number of different funding body and research agencies' frameworks. It's really just stepping through these 4 questions, which really help break down and start framing how you can either do this retrospectively or prospectively, I should say, really talk about your research impact. So I like to start at the top here. And this is at the stakeholder analysis stage or beneficiary stage. We often talk about impact in the positive sense. So who benefits or who has an interest in your research? How would they benefit? And so, just say you're working on policy. Obviously, you would have people who create the policy. So politicians. You might have people who need to deliver the policy. Say we're working in a health service. You might have some governance division, and then the patients perhaps who will be impacted by a policy change. So really just thinking about your stakeholders, try and be specific about who they are, and then what changes for them. The what did you do is the pathway to impact. So what do you need to do to deliver those results or deliver the outcomes of your research? Are there dissemination activities? Are there workshops? Do you need to be part of a board? There's a number of different ways that you can find these pathways to having or realizing the change that your research has had. And why your research? So sometimes it's difficult to think about why your research is needed without thinking of the counterfactual. So what won't change if I don't do this research? Really think about why your research is needed and how it's addressing a gap or improving awareness. Like, that's where this why your research can be answered. And if you get these 4 questions answered, you can really create a compelling story about the impact of your research. Now, these are 2 things that are often spoken about, reach and significance, when we're talking about impact. And they're 2 sides of the same coin. So reach is really about the spread and how widespread your research, the changes arising from your research might be felt, and then significance. So that's really about the depth or intensity of the research. So usually when people are reviewing any kind of impact, they're always thinking about how big is this going to be and how significant is it going to change or transform something. So when you talk about reach and significance, these are also ways of talking about the impact of your work. You can read through the examples just given here. Now, I've spoken about the planning. Sometimes it's a good way to start your plan or talking about your impact or summarizing your impact is to really articulate what you're trying to achieve through impact setting. Now, normally when we're writing grants, we think about a problem solution statement. However, when we're talking about impact, we're really talking about the flipped overall problem. So here's some good examples, poor diagnosis of a specific health condition because of lack of diagnostic tool materials would be the problem and solution. And then here we go, flipping for impact setting. This is how we talk about things in the positive framing. We have good improved information available for diagnosis, which increased or improved the high quality diagnostic tool materials. So when we're talking about impact, we don't talk about necessarily the problem first. We talk about our intention and the planned outcome that arises from that research. So if we think about that impact summary, you can actually do this planning on a page, which this is one of the handouts that will be shared later. And this steps you through the how, the why, the what, and the who. Did I already say that one? But essentially, if you work through this impact plan on a page, you'll be able to easily identify the different areas where your research can and will, and what activities you may need to think about when you're delivering the outcomes of your research, and where you need to look for the and what next question to answer that. At UIW, we have a number of tools. So we have Scholars, and we have Figshare as freeware, which you can actually add of impact to almost like a vault. And that's free. That goes with you as you change institutions. At UIW, we actually have subscribed to Impact Tracker software. And this has an internal facing, interface. And what you do is you create a project, you can add evidence to your vault through a couple of simple clicks, and you can plan your impact because it has a really sophisticated taxonomy of different types or indicators of impact that you can review and distill really what you'll be capturing and measuring along the way to evaluate the impact of your work. There is a public facing area to this as well, and it has export functions, but not everything can be exported, and it doesn't move with you if you change institutions. What we can do though is give you a snapshot of what you've entered into the product if you do move. But that's available to you, and I really recommend it because of that taxonomy and the ability to plan and collaborate through the software. It's actually really useful. Now, there's a few other things you can do, of course, beyond using a software as a solution. You can follow your citation trail if you're looking for knowledge impact. You can set up Google alerts to find out where else your research may be mentioned. You can check your alt metrics, see where your research is being referenced online or via social media. Overton.io is there's a free portal that you can access some of the information, and that looks at global north and south policy documents. It does translation. So if you work in a space and you may not be fully across where your research is being mentioned, you can go into Overton.io, and they've got a really good summary that it's actually created by the person who did altmetric. And also set up time with your faculty liaison librarian, because they're like detectives for finding where else your research has been referenced, not just in academia, but beyond. So things you can do within your own centres or groups is set up an impact email address, send your activities, your pathways, your dissemination, your expert witness, where you've been called on because of your expertise in a particular area. That's a kind of evidence to say that you're a credible, that this is, you're a credible person that does credible research in this particular area. So that kind of creates this story of different kinds of evidence that you can collect to really triangulate and dispel, any concerns that a reader might have from an outside audience about your impact claim. So some people don't understand citations if they're not from academia. If you're talking to a non-academic audience, they might want to know your grant income. So there are all different types of evidence, and that's where that booklet will really be helpful. And you can, send it to one email address if you get a testimonial from the local art gallery or museum, if they've said, your works transformed the understanding in a particular area. That would be a great kind of testimonial to have to talk about your research and the impact it might have had. You can create a template for requesting written feedback. You can draft mini case studies to go on the UIW Scholars website or in a media article, and have impact and engagement as an agenda item at your meetings. Now, building visibility and credibility is really important. So this is just a couple of links to how you might want to display your data or outcomes. So there's different kinds of outcomes, like the findings of your research are like the really early, impacts that you can think about. But then, depending on your kind of research project, there'll be medium-term and long-term outcomes. So really think about how you might package that information and for who, what's the audience. So really putting that audience at the center of your planning is really important. If you wanted to have a look at the case studies that we've submitted in the past, this has all of them that UIW submitted, and you can look up by, topic. These are by FOR code. I'm not sure if the FOR codes, because they were the 2018 codes, they're not relevant now, but you could have a look at all the different impact case studies that were developed for the 2018 assessment. And then here are a few different training places for impact at UIW. We've got the conversation, media training, we've got the websites and different areas. What you can do next: planning, collecting evidence, setting milestones, recording and promoting. It's pretty, sounds straightforward. It does As long as you have the intention though and a process, that's really, the crux of everything. And I guess the last thing I want to say is dissemination does not equal engagement or impact. Ensure you step back from your research and think through all the possible impacts, what has changed, who it changed for, what did you do, and why was your research needed? And then get ready to collect the evidence, refine, redefine, or change your research as you anticipate unknown impacts and are ready to identify them, follow them up. But without the intention of placing the next user of your research in the front of your mind, you're kind of, I guess, undermining the potential and of sustained and meaningful change occurring. So this is just, I guess, something for you to consider is maximizing your impact through alignment with your next user or end user needs. So that's it for me. Thank you. Now, I think Shirley is going to talk next about her experience with impact. I'll just stop sharing my screen. Thanks very much, Shirley.
That's really comprehensive. Firstly, allow me to start by allowing me to pay my respects to the country that I'm on and to acknowledge the ancients and elders of the lands in which this seminar is taking place and all of you that are attending today. Thank you very much for inviting me. What I'd like to do is build on what Lia has said by providing you an example of planning for impact on a project that I am working on with a team. So I'll just share my screen. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about how we've planned for impact in an ARC discovery project that I'm leading. And I'm leading a world-class team in digital learning and professional learning experts. What I'd like to do is, if you could allow me just to give a brief overview of the project, and then I'll pick up on some points that Lia mentioned in terms of the tools provided to give some really concrete examples of how we've thought about impact in this project. I think a key message that I want to share throughout this is that impact is an integral part of the research design, and it's a strategy that you integrate throughout the project. It's not a tack on that you think about after. And I hope that you'll see this as I explain the project. So the ARC project, this is a 4-year project. We're in year 1. And focus is investigating professional learning lives in the digital evolution of work. So essentially, we're wanting to know how professionals and the education and the health sector are keeping up with their knowledge in work contexts that are becoming increasingly digitalised. So just as a bit of background, in terms of digitalisation in the workforce, there's lots of things happening. We've got artificial intelligence, we've got big data that we've got access to now. There's calls for automation, but there's also that fine balance between in sectors that while automation can happen, there are some sectors that, not everything will be automated, but the nature of work is changing. And with that, there's also trends and changes in professional learning and education. So just some of those examples listed there give a sense of how professionals can engage in their ongoing learning. So, COVID has been a classic example of our key shift to online learning, but technology affords us a range of learning experiences that come under the umbrella of extended reality, which is augmented reality, virtual reality environments. There's also a push now for data-driven learning, where organisations are being asked to think more carefully and use the existing data that they've got to come up with learning courses for their employees. And as we all know, in higher education, there's a big push towards micro-credentials. Within the another element that is affecting the context. There is a need for constant upskilling. We're all aware of the argument that we've got to keep up to date with knowledge and skills. There's also the issue of like casualisation and what does that mean for the professional workforce. The working from home, which we're finding ourselves, that's a big influence on how the nature of work is changing for professionals. And again, with COVID, we've also seen this great resignation shift of people making decisions on what they want to do in terms of their ongoing career. So with that, essentially the argument is that the professional learning patterns are changing. I just wanted to just share this graph with you. I just want to give you a brief example. If we look at the ABS recent statistic in terms of work-related training and adult learning statistics, you'll see there that there's two metrics being measured: formal study and non-formal learning. And over the last 10 years, there's been a bit of a decline in that. And that's not really well understood. But importantly, what this graph doesn't show is the range of informal learning, the actual learning that forms part of your work, that comes under the banner of informal learning. This doesn't capture that at all. So we don't really know what people are doing to keep themselves up to date with skills. And in addition, we don't really know what they're doing in terms of how their work is changing based on digitalization and how they use digital technology tools as part of their ongoing learning. So with that, in terms of professional learning, there's this shift in the literature that it's not just an acquisition of knowledge and that you transfer that into the workplace, but rather that work and learning are sort of enmeshed and they both shape each other. And that's what this project is all about, to find out how people are continuing to learn in evolving work contexts and how they're using technology as part of that. So the aspect in yellow is the key crux of the focus for this project, is how people learn on the job, particularly in informal settings, is not well understood. So in terms of our project, we really lack that understanding about professionals' learning practices and how that interplays with their work context. So our key two questions for our ARC project is: what are professionals' learning practices in evolving work contexts, and how these learning practices are enabled and constrained in professional workplaces? The ultimate outcome of our project is to understand how professionals learn as they work in increasingly digitalised work contexts. Just very quickly, we have the theoretical framing from this project is bringing two theories together: self-regulated learning theory and practice theory. I'm not going to explain that too much for purposes of time, but just want to say that that combination of theoretical perspective in our project is fairly novel, and in terms of impact, that's an example, hopefully, of knowledge impact that we'll make from a theoretical perspective of the project. So as I mentioned before, we're focusing on health and the education sector. The reason why we've chosen these two sectors are that they're known for high potential of growth in digitalisation. But as I mentioned before, whilst digitalisation is changing the way that the work is done, they still require sophisticated higher order skills, higher order thinking skills that are most likely not to be automated using technologies. So we thought these two sectors are really, really fertile ground to explore how professionals keep up to date with their knowledge and skills. Our project has a 3-phase approach, and it's a mixed methods approach. So the first phase, we're currently in the first phase, we're in year 1 of this project. The idea of the first phase is to do a broad brush mapping of what people are doing in terms of keeping up to date with their knowledge and skills. The second phase, which we intend will start next year, will be about exploring professionals in their work context, so actually following them in situ, so much more of a deep dive and a qualitative phase. And then based on those first two phases, our idea is then we are going to develop a more sophisticated survey instrument to really examine professional learning practices at scale. So now what I'd like to do is just sort of explain in a little bit more detail the current phase that we're in, and then talk about the overall project objectives and give some examples about impact. So that this first phase that we're in, how are we going to do that? Well, a key aspect of getting participants to fill in our survey is we are recruiting through professional associations. So we've done a mapping of the Australian education and health associations, and we have sent out an email invitation to invite a whole range of national and state and territory-based professional organisations to take part in our study. We've been very fortunate in being able to recruit 19 professional associations, 10 in the health sector and 9 in the education sector. And just to give you a sample of what I'm talking about in terms of professional associations, some examples in the education sector are that we have the Australian Primary, Secondary, Special Education and Catholic Secondary Principals Association on board. We have the Australian Council of Educational Leaders on board, the Australian School Library Association, and the Australian Alliance of Associations in Education, which is a conglomerate of other associations. Who we are targeting in terms of the education space are teachers across the early childhood sector, the primary and secondary school sector. In terms of health, just some examples, we have the Australian Healthcare and Hospital Association joining us, the Australian Society of Medical Imaging and Radiation Therapy, Human Genetics Society of Australia, the Royal College of Pathologists, AGA, just to name a few. So we've been very fortunate to recruit those associations, and they're all very keen to work with us with our project. Now, just looking at that research design, I want to say to you that, you know, the research design in and of itself has been designed for impact, because at each phase, we're going to have outputs that not only inform the next phase, as I've mentioned before, but they'll be outputs in and of their own right. So along the way, we're going to have outputs as well as overarching project outputs. So let me just go towards the ultimate objective of our project, and then I'm going to unpack some examples of impact. So ultimately, the aim of our project is to create an empirical base. So there is very little data about how professionals are keeping up with their learning and in their work contexts. So we'll have an evidence base. We'll have a better understanding about how their learning practices are enabled and constrained in their workplaces. Ultimately, we would like to build a new conceptual model about professional learning for the digital future of work. And with that, accompany that with practical guidelines that will inform individuals, education providers, professional organisations, and government on how to address professional evolving learning needs. So those objectives in themselves, you can see evidence of planning for impact. let me now just unpack and give some specific examples. So I'd like to share with you now, I'm going to just give you an example of filling in that impact tool that Lia briefly mentioned in her presentation. And we'll start with an example impact statement. What I've provided here is essentially the project description that we submitted for the ARC project. And you'll see there that that is an example of an impact statement because it indicates what we are hoping to do, what we are doing, and what the expected outcomes of the project are, and the ultimate significant benefits. So I hope that that sort of provides just an example of an impact statement. In terms of the stakeholder mapping, so one of the other quadrants of the impact tool is a stakeholder mapping. So let's just unpack this. And I spoke about professional associations. So what we've actually done is we've asked the professional associations that we want to collaborate with them. So we want to share the findings with them. So in terms of the interest in the research, we've indicated to them that the findings may provide insights to them about the learning practices of their members. And what we would like to do is work with them in a form of a reference group and, through regular email contact to work with them to have ideas on how our research findings can be best effective for them. So how would they like to see the research findings presented to them that's going to be of most benefit to them? So the idea is that we're working with our professional associations, they're collaborating with our research team, and it is our hope that from our research that they will then advocate our research findings to their members and to their stakeholders. So ultimately, the benefit of the stakeholder in terms of professional associations is that they're going to have evidence then that then could inform their future action. So that's an example of impact. Another example of impact, which again is another aspect of the impact planner, is the research outputs and outcomes. And some examples there are that we'll be providing, as I mentioned, some summary reports of our research findings to our professional associations in a form that is useful to them. We'll also be writing academic research outputs. I indicated that an outcome is to come up with ultimately a model about professional learning and also provide guidelines to a range of other stakeholders. Very quickly, I've indicated some of the beneficiaries, as I've already mentioned. And I suppose then, to wrap up, my three key takeaways are that, as I mentioned, planning for impact is an integral part of a project's research design. I want to say that it's really important to realise there's immediate, intermediate and long-term impact. So the immediate impact for us at the moment is working with our professional associations, and just the fact that they've come on board and interested to participate in our research, that's already an illustration of impact. How we work with them to provide our research findings to them and our academic outputs is more intermediate. And then ultimately that model that I talked about that we'd like to achieve, that's an example of long-term impact. And finally, it's really important to plan for unplanned impact. Lia mentioned this, and I want to say this is a research project. And you don't know what you don't know. That's the whole point of research. So whilst you can plan for impact, you also need to consider that there'll be other opportunities for impact that you may not have been aware of. And for me, I suppose one simple example is being invited to talk about our project today is an example of unplanned impact. But I hope that that's been given you an example of how we've catered for impact in a project. So thank you for listening. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Kate Highfield.
Thanks so much, Shirley. It's really lovely to meet you all. Now, friends, I'm not PowerPointing. I figure we've had 2 PowerPoints today, so I will go without that. I do want to take a moment to say if you've got any questions of any of us, please take a moment to pop them in the chat or use the Q&A function. I will speed through my work so that we can have to have that conversation in case you do have questions. That's where these seminars are so powerful, aren't they? So friends, my name's Kate Highfield. I'm now at the Australian Catholic University, but I've spent the last 4.5 years at Early Childhood Australia. Early Childhood Australia is not a professional association, and it's really important that we understand what these organisations do and how they differ. So Shirley mentioned that she's working with professional associations. Early Childhood Australia is actually a peak body, and it's important that we understand the difference here, because as we're planning for impact, one of the pieces is that we need to know our audience. We need to know who we're hoping to impact. So I've spent the last 4.5 years here at Early Childhood Australia, and one of my core roles there was in research partnerships and research translation, and how we could help academics have their voice heard. So a little bit about ECA, and I will share my screen just so that you have an idea of who ECA are and what they do, because I think understanding your organisations and understanding how they work is really important. So hopefully you can see here the ECA website. One of Early Childhood Australia's key functions is to act as a national body supporting early childhood around Australia, and it has daily contact with a little over 130,000 educators. Now, for us, in terms of research impact, as researchers, knowing that there's a possible audience there of that size is really important. But we do have to understand that that audience could be anything from a parent who's just interested in this space right through to other academics who are also working in this space. ECA's vision is that every young child is thriving and learning. And to reach that vision, they have a really important piece of strategic goals. So if you look at the ECA goals, there's 5 priorities for the organisation, and part of planning for impact is knowing where you can have impact. So ECA has the priority of speaking up for young children, collaborating for impact, championing beyond quality, leading and inspiring professional learning, and being sustainable and effective. One of the pieces as we look at this type of organisation is that we need to think, well, where does my research fit? Does my research fit with the Australian Council of Educational Leaders? Does it fit with the Primary Principals Association? Does it fit with Early Childhood Australia? Who am I trying to target? And then the second part is, what priority of that organisation and am I meeting in terms of needs? You see, the best impact happens through partnership, through long and sustained relationships where people know and value your research and where they feel a part of your research. We do see a lot of fatigue in teachers around the country, whether they're early childhood teachers or university academics. We recognise that there's a tremendous sense of fatigue. And of course, we've also got that massive teacher shortage happening at the moment, which means having time to participate in research, to read research and be partners in research is valuable time. And so as you're planning for impact, I would argue that you need to be planning for relationships and partnerships. Now that means we need to, as researchers, and I'm looking at this myself, go beyond researching what teachers are doing into a space of working with teachers to have research that's actually meeting their needs at the moment. So talking to your teacher colleagues, talking to your professional associations, talking to your peak bodies, so that you can actually be building a research plan that meets their needs. At ECA, they've set their 5 priorities, and those priorities are in place for the next 2 years. If you were to pitch research to them that is outside their priorities, they're probably not going to give you a space to work in that area. Now, most of us think, oh man, 133,000 teachers, that's fantastic. I could get access to them. And indeed you can, but we have to be very strategic about that approach so that it aligns with the organisation's needs, but then it also meets the organisation's audience. So at ECA, yes, it's a massive group of people, but you have to think through, well, who are they writing for and how are they publishing in that space? So ECA has 4 key publications that come out each quarter. One is for academics, the Australasian Journal of Early Childhood. One is for the service managers, which is the research in practice. So that's for your educational leaders, directors and service managers, the research in practice series. One called the Everyday Learning series, and another called Every Child, which is a free magazine that goes to every member. Now, sometimes when we think about our academic metrics, our bibliometrics, we think, right, we've got to aim for that top journal. Well, in fact, I'd be arguing if you're looking to have an impact on educators and educational practice, you need to be having a 2-tiered impact strategy. One is to work with those top-tiered journals so that you're getting those bibliometrics in place. But the second impact factor would, for us in the education space, be having an impact with teachers and on policymakers. And one of the pieces that really intrigues me is that some of our highest citations come from free and open access resources. And I'd like to, if that's okay, just talk through a couple of those with you. So we know that teachers, as they graduate university, often lose access to the libraries. That means that if we're looking for traditional citations or traditional bibliometrics where we can see who is citing our work, that we might just lose a whole element of our audience. Because if you can't access the library, you're not going to be able to get into those journals that have a paywall behind them. And in fact, there's some really scary research around teachers no longer engaging in the professional research journals. So what ECA has done, and in fact, many organisations are working in this space, is that they're very strategically looking at their publications and looking at how they can amplify publications that are of massive relevance to their audience. So one of the publications I mentioned that ECA puts out each quarter is Every Child. It's a professional magazine. It's written at about a 12-year-old language level so that it's accessible to all. But what they also do is, and I'll just quickly show you the index for Every Child, is that every issue, every issue also has a free article. So if your work aligns to ECA's strategic goals, you could ask that your article then becomes a free article. So from one of the more recent issues, a free article is by one of your colleagues, Joe Grimmond. Now, because this is free and open access, it means that it's available and it's accessible, and it means that your impact can be higher. We also recognise that those click-through results, so knowing how many people have read or downloaded the article, is really important to academics and researchers. And so if you're in partnership with your peak bodies, with your professional organisations, it gives you a chance to look at that data in the back end. So if ECA is really advocating for your work, they will be helping you to promote what's happening in that space. They will be providing those free articles, perhaps helping you with blog, or giving you a chance to find out the user stats on that space. So in education, in early childhood education, an article that's got a great number of citations might have 200 citations. Whereas at ECA, they're looking at things like 20,000 downloads in a 24-hour period. So those forms of statistics are far more impactful when you're starting to think through the breadth of your impact. I will put a big caveat in there, and Lia mentioned this earlier, that dissemination is not always impact. So when you're thinking about readability statistics and those bibliometrics that ECA provides, they might not necessarily mean that people have actually read your article. And so when you're articulating your impact journal and impact journey in that space, you do need to be very careful that downloads don't necessarily mean true impact. Although I think many of us would agree that those forms of bibliometrics are really useful for us, and indeed they're really useful for giving evidence that people are engaging with your work, and engagement and readability are that sort of first step on that impact journey. I do want to also share with you the ASECOR website for those of you who haven't looked at this lately, because this gives off the professional associations and indeed all of the peak bodies all in one spot. So they update this reference group every year, and it gives you a brilliant listing of organisations that you might seek to partner with if you're in the education and care space. I want to leave you with one more piece though, and that is the power of social media. So Early Childhood Australia has an average reach or a following of 134,000 people. Now that 134,000 people gives you an incredible chance to have your work amplified. Similarly, other organisations such as Community Early Learning Australia has a slightly smaller number of followers, but those followers might be more engaged. So when we're looking at social media's data, we need to go beyond just the number of people working with the page as a whole and go into who is actually reading those articles, who is clicking through. I want to leave you with one last thought, which is your own work that was done in partnership with ECA. So this Plan Learn Together website gives you an incredible platform as researchers to consider amplifying your voice. This site was developed with Early Childhood Australia and Playgroups Australia, and it has a blog for academics who are to share their work. This one has a slightly different focus because the focus is on other teachers and particularly on parents at home. Again, I'm sure the webmaster of this site will give you the stats on the blog and the stats on the readability as you go through there, but it's absolutely worth considering. So for me, just as a quick summation, don't just research people, but partner with people for research. If you're working with peak bodies, make sure that you know what their strategic goals are so that your research is meeting their needs, because then you'll have a much clearer pathway for impact. And of course, they've got a greater buy-in. So looking at partnerships with your participants, but also partnerships with the research bodies. And then making sure that you're looking at multiple audiences at the same time. Friends, I'm going to leave it there and throw to you for questions.
Kate, Shirley and Lia, I could listen to you all day. What wonderful insights you've given us. I do have a question that has come through, and Kate, it's for you. Just thinking around the messages that you've given us around relationships and partnerships, I wonder if you could give us a quick do's and don'ts for academics when they're trying to reach out and connect with professional associations from your experience.
And it's a good question, Lisa. When I was at ECA, we got hundreds of requests every day, and they were for everything from NH and MRC grants to ARC grants to Potter Foundation grants. Talk with them early. Don't go with this is my research question and this is my problem. Have that partnership conversation earlier and say, I'm really interested in micro-credentialing, to use that as an example. What can you tell me about your perspective in this space? So that we go in with that curious mindset, and then we're creating a genuine problem. I think for most of the peak bodies, when you say, this is my research project, would you like to partner? Your likelihood that people will agree to partner with you diminishes dramatically. Whereas if you go in and say, we're looking at micro-credentialing, let's work on something that would work for you and work for me. Happy to chat further about that, but it's about real relationships, isn't it?
Yeah, and that consultation early to make sure that it's a genuine problems. And I really liked that challenge that you gave us, Kate, around thinking around what the problems are in the field rather than us coming with the ideas all the time. I think that's really useful. Something else that has struck us is the flexibility of thought that's required, and the sorts of impact is often beyond the life cycle of a particular research project. So I think for academics, where we've got a period of funding and we try and do as much as we can within that time, and then we move to the next project, but perhaps an impact and engagement agenda requires some different thinking. Lia, I wonder if you've got any comments to make there.
Yes, it's true. I mean, the people that created Wi-Fi didn't know its impact until, many years later. So I think as researchers, we are always asking questions that build upon an already established field, and we're either adopting, we're doing something different, which makes it our research, but acknowledging what your contribution is in that pathway is also important to think about on that journey. But having that relationship is really integral, because you can sustain a research program over a length of time if you've planned for that relationship to withstand the test of time. So I guess that's kind of my comment.
Thanks, Leah. I don't know, Shirley or Kate, if you wanted to say anything more there.
I'd love to, because I think sometimes it's about making sure that you're personally tracking your research impact rather than necessarily just the project. And that's even things like how many people have retweeted something that you put out there. You know, it's that follow through piece is massive, isn't it?
And just in my experience, you know, when you do one research project, another research project, it becomes a program of research. And through my experience, you know, I have a program of research with colleagues that goes back 20 years, and we're still seeing impact of, you know, tools, the design tools for teachers. That's the area that I've researched in that have been taken up now of work that we did 10, 15 years ago. So it is a long, slow burn. And that's the whole idea of doing impactful research.
And research that feeds into a program of research. And I think that's really good. So rather than thinking around discrete individual projects, how the projects all fit together for a collective identity is what I'm hearing is really important. You've given us so much to think about. I think the big question for me is the who and the challenges that you've each given us around the focus on next user, end user, community and stakeholders, and really thinking around who benefits from the work and how we can actually engage them sooner rather than later in that. So I thank you for those insights. We could keep discussing this for a long time, but I'm conscious our hour is up. So very heartfelt thanks to each of you, to Lia, to Shirley and to Kate for joining us in the session today. And I'm sure you've stimulated lots of conversations, and I hope that we can continue those conversations through our very vibrant Early Start Research Network. So thank you for being such great friends to Early Start. And just a reminder for those who are regular attendees of these sessions, and for those who may want to become regular attendees, our next session is scheduled for the 4th of October, and our focus is on collecting data in educational settings. And we're going to hear from a wealth of experience from Dr. Mitchell Parker, Lynn Cronin, and Professor Mary Ryan from ACU. So thanks very much, everybody. It's great to have you here, and look forward to continued conversations.